give us an introduction into the overall, say, situation in the region.
Thank you very much. So at the moment, the situation is, we're talking about 6 countries here, which are commonly known nowadays as the Western Balkans: Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And the current situation in the region with electricity is that it's very largely dependent on a mixture of coal and hydropower. Most of the countries have a kind of mix, whereas Albania is completely hydropower dependent and Kosovo is almost completely coal dependent. And all of the generation infrastructure, almost all, is pretty outdated. First, the excuse was the war, but actually a lot of time's passed since then, and the governments are still kind of talking about what they're going to build more than they are actually building. But they generally plan to continue in the same vein as before. This is kind of driven by a combination of kind of doing what you already know, but also interests of specific groups behind the plans. At the moment, there is 8.3 gigawatts of coal power in the region. This is all lignite, and so there's a lot of also open cast mines, a lot of people employed in the coal mines, and in fact, kind of too many people employed in the coal mines in terms of productivity. The productivity is pretty low in most of the countries by European standards. And so there is a kind of momentum to continue with this industry, kind of as if it's possible to do infinitely. And since there has been not much investment in recent years, there is, although many of the plants are more than 40 years old, there is not any kind of a talk of coal phase out yet. This is really different from the situation in the EU. There is also not a sufficient surplus of electricity that you could just close the coal plants and nothing would happen. I mean, this is simply not possible at this stage. So definitely some investment is needed in the energy sector, but it's the question, which kind? At the moment, we are aware of 9 coal plants in the region which are being actively pursued. That means in all of the countries except Albania. 1 in Serbia, 5 in Bosnia, 1 in Montenegro, 1 in Kosovo, and 1 in Macedonia. And in fact, there is a lot more ideas for coal plants. Even 9 is not enough, but for the proponents. But these are the ones which someone is kind of working on moving forward at the moment. And I think it's important to bear in mind here that we are talking about a region which totals around 18 million people. So this is actually a huge number of plants. I mean, for German standards, it maybe sounds like nothing, but if you look at the population, it's a huge number of plants out of any proportion to what is needed or what would make any sense. And unfortunately, in the whole region, there is a serious lack of planning associated with these plants. Most of the plans have been around for decades, and they just get transferred from government to government to government to government without any kind of review, and they kind of slowly move forward, sometimes stopping, sometimes speeding up, sometimes stopping, and sometimes speeding up again. So it's quite hard to actually measure what is planned, but it's around 9 plants. Obviously, I guess many people are here familiar with the problems around coal per se. Dennis will speak more concretely about the problems in Tuzla, so I won't go really into that. But I think it's important to say that as well as the kind of general problems with coal related to health and climate, there are specific issues with each of these projects. It was mentioned in the introduction that all of these countries are signatories to the Energy Community Treaty, which brings with it certain obligations to adhere to some of the EU environmental legislation. There are also all countries which are working towards joining the EU. Some sooner, some later, but the direction of travel is towards the EU, and all of these countries see their future in the EU. For that reason, and for the fact that coal plants will last for about 40 years, it's pretty logical that if they really do insist on going ahead with coal plants, that they should be at least in line with the legal obligations. I mean, we are completely against the construction of new plants, let's be clear, but the minimum legal requirements are not even being fulfilled at the moment. For example, last year in the EU, the new pollution control standards came into play, called the LCP BREF, which are considerably tighter than the standards in all of the countries at the moment, and yet none of the plant promoters are designing the plants to be in compliance with these standards, even though going forward, as the countries join the EU or as the energy community adds new legislation to the treaty, at some point they will have to comply. So this is purely short-sighted thinking and just trying to avoid making the projects more expensive. Also, we have very limited access to economic information about the projects, but from what we know, almost none of them are taking the CO2 costs into account. At the moment, the countries are not part of the ETS, and so they don't have to pay, and so they think they will never have to pay. And even some of the feasibility studies show that in case an ETS price is applied, even a very low one, it shows that the plants wouldn't be viable. But the governments are just acting as if this doesn't exist and it's not going to happen to them. Other issues that we've encountered have been around the tender processes. Since the European public banks have mostly decided to stop financing coal plants, now the main player in terms of financing is China, and the main companies which are interested in building the plants are Chinese companies. And what we've seen in some of the cases is, for example, with this Kostolac plant in Serbia, there was simply no tender process. There was just an agreement made with a Chinese company, and then there was an agreement made between the Serbian government and the Chinese government to free from the obligation of conducting a tender process, and hey presto, we have our company without any kind of competitive procedure whatsoever. And the other issue we've noticed a lot is subsidies. The countries are obliged to follow most of the EU state aid rules, but we see that there is very little political will to do so. And there are a lot of subsidies, like providing the land for plants to be built on, providing state guarantees under very favorable conditions for the companies, and so on. So there are a lot of, putting aside even the usual issues associated with coal, there are a lot of specific problems with the plants. So the situation is obviously quite serious. The governments in the region are very hard to influence. There is a lot of corruption, weak courts, and so on. However, I think it's important also to underline that because we are talking about small economies, we are also talking about southern countries. So there is a lot of potential for renewable energy, especially the solar energy is really untapped. And so I think for me, it's particularly frustrating to see relatively small countries with a relatively high renewable energy potential not taking advantage of that. And I think this is the country's real chance to turn around and take advantage of their renewable energy potential. Also with the caveat that also this has to be done sustainably. As Jörg mentioned, I work also on hydropower plants in the region, and this is an issue for us that in being critical of coal, the governments tend to think of hydro as the only other option, whereas the region is actually a biodiversity hotspot, and there has been a real outbreak of very small hydropower plants on every stream in the whole region, basically, in the last few years. So, I mean, at the same time as criticizing coal, we have to be sure that the renewable options are also going to be done sustainably, and there is really no alternative but to strengthen the rule of law, the environmental acquis, and so on, to make sure that of course, especially the energy planning. So there is a lot of work ahead of us, but for sure these countries have the potential to move very quickly from coal-based economies to renewables and to more efficient economies. This was something I didn't mention, that also a lot of energy is wasted in the distribution system, in the usage. Some other countries use a lot of electricity for heating. There are enormous opportunities to take relatively simple measures to actually reduce the energy usage and to ramp up the renewables usage rather quickly. It's a question of political will. And why, just to conclude, I think it's important to say, why are we coming to talk in Berlin about this question? We see that things are slowly moving in the EU in a better direction. The legislation, the targets is slowly moving in a good direction. And we really need the help of European countries and the European Commission to support through the energy community or through whichever processes they find appropriate, to support the region to stop the development of coal and turn around towards energy efficiency and renewables much quicker than it is now. Because if those new plants get built, it's too late. We've locked in the money, we've locked in the carbon. We have really restricted our space for movement in the future. So there is potential, but we really need a lot of backup and political assistance now from the EU countries as well.
Thank you, Pippa and Dennis.